So in the past couple of days in Crimea, things have gotten a little tense between protesting Ukrainian nationalists, many of whom are actually ethnic Crimean Tatars, many of whom are in exile from their natural home in the Crimean Peninsula. There's been a lot of tensions that have been building between the Russians on one side and these Ukrainian nationalists, Crimean nationalists. There's many different names you can call them. In fact, there's many different groups that are there protesting. But the fact is that now we're right at the 2-year anniversary of the beginning of the protests that eventually took down Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. It's the beginning, this is the 2-year anniversary of what they started to call the Euromaidan Revolution that has now really started to change the face of Ukraine and moved Ukraine in a much more European direction than it had been before. But one of the things we're starting to see, and it's actually been going on now for some time, is that the Crimean Tatars, who are the ethnic people, they're ethnically related to Turks, but they're in a way indigenous to the Crimean Peninsula, they were actually deported wholesale from Crimea in 1944 by Joseph Stalin. They were deported to Central Asia, and many of them only began to return to Crimea in the late 1980s during the time of Glasnost and Perestroika, and then once the Soviet Union fell, they started to return en masse to where Crimean Tatars now make up somewhere between 12 and 20% of the population of the Crimean Peninsula. And these Crimean Tatars really looked at Ukraine as kind of their savior. They, understandably, because of their history with Stalin and the Soviet Union and Russians, were very keen on not returning to that kind of past, and so many of them actually became quite staunch Ukrainian patriots. So many of them, when Russia took over the Crimean Peninsula and annexed it back in March of 2014, many of them were quite vehement about their dislike and distaste of this new Russian rule. There were a lot of them protesting to the point where their leaders were banned from entering the peninsula for a span of many years. A lot of Crimean Tatars chose to go into exile in mainland Ukraine. The Crimean Tatar television station ATR, or ATR in English, is now based in Kiev rather than in the Crimean capital because it was refused renewal of its broadcast license by the Russian authorities after a period of time. So a lot of these Crimean Tatars have been attempting to hold a blockade of Ukrainian goods and services traveling into the Crimean Peninsula. Crimea is attached to the Ukrainian mainland only by a very thin strip of land, and there's really only one road that goes in and out, so it's a relatively easy road to blockade. And so they've been doing this actually now for several weeks, and just a few days ago there were what the Ukrainian authorities are calling terrorists. It's still reasonably unclear who engaged in this act of sabotage, but 2 of the major electrical trunk lines that run electricity from mainland Ukraine into Crimea, which are really the main ways that Crimea receives electricity, they were blown up quite wholesale. And, you know, there have been blames placed on various groups. It seems as though it was probably either Crimean Tatars or some of the radical Ukrainian nationalists who were looking to stir up a bit more of a fight between Russia and Ukraine. But the fact of the matter is that they were blown up. Much of Crimea was plunged immediately into darkness, and a lot of the peninsula now is running largely on generators. Some have access to coal power plants, but the fact of the matter is that the lion's share of Crimea's electricity comes from the Ukrainian mainland, as does, by the way, its water. There's been a lot of speculation that this particular action was taken right now because the Russians are close to completing a similar electrical trunk line that would run from Russia across the Kerch Straits and then into Crimea to help provide Crimea electricity from the Russian mainland, which then would have made the destruction of these Ukrainian-based towers of much less geopolitical importance. The idea being that perhaps while Russia is rather preoccupied in Syria, that then perhaps this is a good time for people who are interested. And by the way, this is not necessarily the Ukrainian authorities. There's a lot of different groups at play here. The Ukrainian authorities seem actually quite anxious to restore power, seem quite anxious to figure out who exactly was responsible for these acts of sabotage. But people who are interested, the Crimean Tatars, Ukrainian nationalists, seemed very keen on taking this opportunity both before Russia finished its electrical line into Crimea and while Russia seems preoccupied with Syria rather than Ukraine. They sensed an opening and it seems as though they've taken it.